We're still there. Ah, usually we record towards the end, don't we? No. Oh, no, you always do good. It's going to be fun watching this next month when he's up here and doing that at the same time. This is going to be a real trick. He's going to need some help. So the numbers are down. There's a couple reasons why it's down and why we're watching it so carefully. One reason it's down is because it's down. Hey, it's also down because of the home testing kits. So the reason where those case counts come from is when you go to a lab with your doctor or public health or commercial, and they test you, they report if it's a positive finding to the health department. And because you're doing home testing, nobody's reporting it to public health. And they don't want to report it to public health because then you get tagged for you need to be doing isolation at home. So it's a combination of underreporting and fewer cases. So a decision made this last week on the case of COVID is that nationally we're going to stop contact tracing. That's it. No more contact tracing. There's just too many cases to count. So there are more cases actually in some cases, but there's fewer hospitalizations and deaths relative to the number of cases there are. So what does all that mean? It means things are getting better. But it didn't get better fast enough for us to do a banquet safely because you could say, well, we got the same amount of people in the room tonight. Why didn't you do a banquet? Well, what's different about a banquet? You take the mask off and you eat food and you get liquored out. You know, it doesn't work very well. So we didn't want to have an event among all of you that would be an event that wouldn't be as fondly remembered. So we're going to push it a couple of months. We'll tell you more about that this evening. Next slide, Dave, if you're ready. This is good. Okay, so I reported to the board last month. Thought were accomplishments. My term as president ends tonight. And the new president, the new administration who you'll meet in a few moments, you know these people, you just don't know that they're in a new role perhaps. But the last year has been pretty significant. First of all, we returned to in-person meetings. That was a real plus. I have to tell you, for me, it was a real highlight because we went through about half the year. Okay. So we got back to in-person meetings, which is great. July meeting was our first. It's pretty exciting because it was really fun watching you all come together. It's like a family that hasn't been together for years. Well, you haven't been. And now things are back pretty much to normal. We expect it to stay that way. So thank you for being here and thank you for doing that. But we didn't just do that. We also changed a different day of the month, a different Friday. We moved it to the second Friday so we'd have fewer schedule conflict. And we changed the meeting location from Salmon Creek up here. And all of that has so far worked out real well. I can tell you from the behalf of Julie, the general manager here, she's very pleased to have us here. We made a deal that the room is ours to have at no cost, provided 5 people eat a meal at the little restaurant that they have. And we're far exceeding that. So keep doing it. It helps infuse some funding into the Post. The Post is not just tolerating us, they're happy to have us here. And so thank you for that as well. Our membership, top 400 members. Not exactly sure we'll keep it that way, but we did hit 400 and that was a big accomplishment. And we did that during COVID. Seems very strange, doesn't it? All these organizations that I'm affiliated with all took a big dive. We found some compliance issues, with the way we do business and some of the state law requirements. And we outlined what the top ones were, and we took action to close those gaps. So I'm pleased to report to you that we are in compliance with the vast majority of the not-for-profit in the state of Washington. One of the other big accomplishments, I think, is although we've been friendly, have worked closely with Aries in Clark County for many years. Many of you are Aries members. We managed to negotiate and close a formal memorandum of agreement with Aries. So Aries is now, as you know, part of the club, but they're semi-autonomous, meaning they have their own leadership and they follow. They sort of got one leg in our camp and one leg in the Cressa camp as an organization, part of emergency management here in our county. So that's sweet. When I leave office tonight, I've promised Michael, the EC, that we will be investing more time into helping to develop Aries. Now that we're in a good place legally, we can receive funding from grantees, grantors, and we can use that funding. Now we just need to get all the other things done, which is also underway, which is good. We we conducted a very successful field day at Tim's house, absent the picnic. We couldn't do the picnic for the same reasons, COVID, but nonetheless, field day came off beautifully. And I'd like to recognize and thank Dave, and Tim, who is not with us this evening, for the hard work it took to do that. A lot of you participated in it. A lot of you came and took shifts as operators. It was a good event. So we haven't lost any momentum there. And then lastly, because of the new state laws, there have been some changes, both case law. You know what case law is, right? Case law is a case that's been decided by the court and therefore influences how a law is interpreted. And a lot of not-for-profit officers, directors and officers in organizations are getting personally hurt when the organization is sued. And most of these are related to sexual harassment, all the stuff that you're reading on the news. So what we needed to do then is to go out and secure insurance to ensure that directors and officers are covered. So they're not personally culpable for the consequences of a lawsuit. So that was expensive. It was important to do. And it was important to do so that we can continue to attract high quality directors and officers to our club. If you knew that you and your family's finances could be at risk, you wouldn't be an officer or a director of a club. I mean, it's just that simple. And that's what other clubs are facing. Fortunately, we have the financial wherewithal to make that happen. And we completed that before the end of the year. So some good things happened this last year. And as you know, with Dave going forward and the new directors, it'll be even better. Please. So I'd like to ask the outgoing board of directors to please stand at this point. If you're a director right now, please stand up. Board of directors. Okay. All right. So we don't have everybody here, obviously, but we wanted to make sure that we recognized the board of directors that are outgoing now. Judith and Marilyn, I mean, a lot of these people are staying in a different role. Tom, unfortunately, and Tim are stepping off the board and are taking new roles within the club. We hope to figure out a place to put Tom because you're too valuable and you work too hard for us. Yeah, you did, but you missed it. Sounds like a presidential election.
Been fighting COVID. I'm not, what's the word I'm looking for? I had it a minute ago. I can't spread anything right now. I've got this persistent cough. Got to go in for a CAT scan hopefully next week. So I'm going to be hacking and coughing, but I'm better than I was.
No, it's the sick in the mind that we're concerned about, Tom. No, you've done great, Tom, and thank you. Marilyn, you've done great. Thank you. It's just been wonderful. Next slide, please. So now the officers, if you stood as an officer this year, would you take a moment, please stand? Yeah, James or Iwarn and John Allen here, who is our emergency response coordinator. That's his job. He keeps his job if there are no emergencies in Clark County. So here in the next couple of months, I hope to come back, probably with Michael, and we'll talk as part of the education for our club a little bit about how does it look when you marry up Iwarn Aries, and the rest of the club membership. It's a process that we've developed working with Cressa. We need to get back to the team leaders of Aries and then later to the board to make sure everybody is sort of like doing, their heads are nodding in the same way. And once we do that, we'll share that with you. But I can tell you it's a very positive move and good stuff. So now I get to have some fun. Maybe I'll turn it over to you for this whole thing. So last year when I ended up being the president, you know how that happened, right? You know, one day I was the vice president, the next day I was the president because of some changes in somebody in Jeff's occupational needs, and that was completely understood. But we weren't having any physical meetings, and Steve, who was the last president, he was thinking about how am I going to transition when we don't have a meeting, and we ended up meeting in the parking lot of a theater. You saw that my wife took the picture, and that was it. So I want to do it in a little bit more classy way if I could. And I'd like to welcome the new and incoming president of the Clark County Amateur Radio Club, Dave Sherba. And not only does he have this thing to carry around for the next year and sign, he gets a gavel that I don't think I've ever used, unless you got roaches or something. So this is supposed to be like the baton of office or something. So there you are, sir. Congratulations. And I'll tell you what, the best decision I made last year was to ask you to become the vice president because it assured us a good future going forward. So thank you. Yeah, good stuff. You want to click the next one? Actually, that's your time. You should get Jeff to move over one seat and have him control it.
So we've got a new board, and let me introduce the members that are here this evening. Jeff, if you can stand, and Jason and Marilyn. Not with us this night is Mark Lacey, and Andrew is not here, and Tim. No, Tim's not on the board. Reese isn't here. Reese is ill. And so we have the three absent, but the three are here. We've juggled things around a little bit. Now, Marilyn's now in charge of operations. Jason's the technical director. And Jeff, you agreed to do what? Liaison. And so the other, Andrew is going to be the general, and Mark Lacey is staying as records, and Reese is still staying as the activity coordinator. So that's balanced out a little bit. We got a new task matrix going forward. I thank these three for volunteering, and we're definitely going to get a lot of good work out of them. So these are the training classes that Delvin and Barb have got arranged for the coming. We have technician class that Delvin's teaching in March the 11th, 12th, 18th, and 19th. A general class for April is scheduled, and Barb's YL class is set for March 3rd, 5th, 8th, 10th, 11th, and the 17th. And all of these classes are timed in such a way that they align up well with the VE session. So almost immediately after you're done, you can go take the VE exam. So if you're interested in getting your license or advancing to the general license, please reach out to these folks and make a reservation and agree to attend the classes. So
Could I add that those two are here, Delvin's here and Barb is here. So if you're a newbie and you came in and you're not sure who these two people are, go for one of the raised hands.
okay, I have to fiddle with something here for a moment, and then we'll start the presentation. So the problem is I have to stop one presentation and start the other, and you're working off of two different screens, so it's a little bit disorienting if you're not.
But who can see it? Whoever's monitoring this whole thing. Just ties up bandwidth. Good.
Okay, can everybody see it now?
Can you tell how many people are on?
It's
Out in the Zoom word, you can see the screen, okay?
28.
Oh.
You might want to mute them. All right, so let's just start a little bit where this came from. We had an ARIES exercise a couple weeks ago where we did peer-to-peer communication. In preparation for that, we had a lot of practice stuff going on. And one of the things we found is that people with perfectly good TNCs and perfectly good radios weren't able to actually make good connections with each other. And I was one of the culprits. I thought my equipment was working perfectly well. And what we found out is there was a whole series of obstacles that people faced trying to get this stuff to work. So we're going to talk just briefly about how to figure out what serial port you're on. And Vern did a presentation a while ago at the ARIES meeting. It talked about this, but I'm going to just rehash it a little bit because during the exercise, that was an issue for a lot of people. We'll talk a little bit about the physical connection between the TNC and the radio. And the biggest issue, the thing I really started out doing this, was because the levels, in order to operate correctly, turned out not to be as simple as you would think. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we go. And I'm going to talk, we're going to focus on two types of TNCs. There's lots of TNCs out there, but the two we're going to focus on mostly is the KPC3, because that's used throughout our organization, and many people who even aren't in ARIES have those. And then the other thing is we have tiny tracker 4s, which are in all the orange kits that can be deployed anywhere. And any one of you might be responsible for helping operate one of those. So it was a good thing to talk about how to set the levels for that. So go ahead. Now, to get the serial port to work is really pretty straightforward, but you got to know enough about Windows to get into trouble. So you really, in the old days, when you had a 9-pin connector on the back of your computer, it was COM port 1 or COM port 3, and it never changed. Well, the reality is when you plug in a USB serial to converter, one day you can plug it in, and it's going to be port 6 and 7, and the next day it's going to be port 9, and it might be port 14. So even though you think you know what port number it is, if you get a Windows update, you get another device loaded up, it can rearrange your port numbers. So everybody should know how to figure out what port number the serial device is on your computer so that you can get it to operate. And to do that, basically, you open the device manager and you have to look at what's there, and then you have to plug in the serial adapter and then make a note of what changes. It's not difficult, but you got to go find the device manager, which depending on which version of Windows you have, it could be a variety of places. And go ahead and the next slide there. So this shows you the before on the left. I have my device manager open and I'm looking at a port, and I have a COM3 that's built into this particular computer. And then I plugged in a dual USB to serial conversion. And now all of a sudden I got COM port 5 and COM port 6. Now I have to tell you, 2 months ago when I plugged that same cable, that same device in, it used to be COM port 10 and 11. Why it's now 5 and 6, I have no idea. But I had to look, and it made a real difference, because if I assumed it was still the other one, I would never get this to work. So this is as simple as you do. You just open it up, you have it open, you plug in the device, and you look and see what COM ports you get. Pretty straightforward.
Users Zoom cannot see the slides.
Okay, give us a second. Okay, now can you see them?
That looks a lot better. Thank you.
You should have said something earlier.
Well, we didn't want to interrupt you too much.
Believe me, please interrupt. Okay, so this is the before and after. You can see I had just the one COM port, and now when I plugged in that USB adapter, I got 2 COM ports. And you write down what one it is, because if you're like me, I have short-term memory issues. I won't remember that COM 5 is the one I really want to work with when I get to the next part. Okay. So Now that you've got, we're not going to go into the wiring of these things because there are so many variations of how you can get them wired. But basically there's two types of devices, serial devices, a data terminal and a data set. And almost all of the TNCs require what's called a null modem cable to work properly. So if you buy the cable from the manufacturer, you should be all set. On one of mine, I have a null modem cable and I have to have a little male-to-male adapter so it actually plugs in. But all in all, it's pretty straightforward. Now, this is where life gets interesting because there's lots of assumptions about what the baud rate will be or how fast your computer is going to talk to the TNC. If you have the KPC3, it's going to assume that you're going to work at 9600 baud. And assume is a bad word, as we all know. So you should verify it. And we'll talk a little bit about how you can reset them if you don't. Now, the tiny tracker, most of them are default to 19.2 kbits per second. However, if you get a tiny tracker and for whatever reason it gets reset, you have to go through an auto detect mode to get it to get the right baud rate. Because it actually, the tiny tracker, when it resets, and I'll show you, it actually resets to connect to a GPS and not to a computer. And it actually sets at 4800 baud. So it's not going to talk at all. If you ever get it reset, you're going to spend hours trying to get it to talk if you don't know a couple of tricks. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. Now, handshake, the KPC3 supports the handshake lines, hardware handshake. You can actually run almost all these with no handshake. The communication isn't that hot and heavy that it gets overrun, but and the tiny tracker has no handshaking at all. And on the tiny tracker, you have to make sure you get an interface cable because it actually has two serial ports connected on the one 9-pin connector. And so if you don't have the right cable, you'll actually have data streams available on other pins that the RS-232 standard has for handshaking lines. So it's important that you have that. You actually make a cable up specific or you buy the one that you can get from a tiny tracker. So I use a dumb terminal to get started with this because WinLink, which is one of the targets that we're trying to do with the exercise, WinLink has no way to actually see the data serial stream or even check things that are going on. And this is going to be important because we're going to use a dumb terminal to set some of the levels later on. Now there's a freebie. There's a bunch of dumb terminal programs. You can get PuTTY, you can get HyperTerminal, and this one I found is pretty easy. It's called RealTerm, and it's free. My favorite's Procom, but if you want to buy a Windows version of Procom these days, it's like $800. It's an outrageous amount of price for what used to be a $50 program that I used for years when I did Packet. So the nice thing about this is that you can see on the bottom right, you can actually see the status of all the handshake lines. So you can see whether or not there's data going back and forth. You can see whether the data set ready and the terminal ready, if those are all working. You can actually see those right there. And so you don't need, I carry around with me these little breakout boxes all the time because I used to debug these and I could look at how the data was going. And so the other thing I used to have is a little 9-pin connector with pins 2 and 3 jumper together. So I could plug it in and just type on the terminal and make sure I had the right COM port. You can see here, I can set the baud rate, 9600 baud, the port number, and then I can click change. And you can see I was hooked up to the KPC3 here. So I have, actually this is hooked up to an old PK232 that I have on my radio desk, and it's on COM port 1. So this is what I was working with in the first time to do the debugging of this. One other thing, once WinLink has talked to your TNC, it sets it in all different kinds of modes. It doesn't echo the characters. It doesn't do line feeds. So when you get the dumb terminal mode after you've actually had WinLink running, you have to send some commands to get things all straight again. And down there, one of the commands is you send echo on, and then in this case, it was auto line feed on the display, so that it would quit writing over the same line all the time. The KPC3 is a little different, but you still may have to look for those two commands. So why is level adjustment important? Well, the specifications for the audio input that goes to a radio has changed a lot. Originally, every time you did packet, you had to plug into the microphone and you had to connect to the speaker wire because we didn't have these data ports on the radios. So back in the day, they had very specific levels, and most microphones, turns out, produce about 50 millivolts peak. And then the adjustment levels for the speaker were pretty straightforward. And so a lot of these TNCs were targeted around 50 millivolts. But as I found out very rudely in the last few weeks, is my brand new Yaesu FTM 100 needs almost 300 millivolts to work right. And so I was amazed. I was able to connect with Bern, who was about 8-9 miles away from me. I connected to all sorts of people, and my actual deviation, because I was using the default values, was about a half a kilohertz. That was my deviation. And the fact that it worked at all is actually pretty amazing. It might have something to do with the 15 dB gain antenna I was using, but just the same, it should not have worked very well. So setting these levels has become far more important. And if you actually have a 9600 baud modem, you have to change the levels, even though it's the same TNC. So it turns out that if I'm running 1200 baud, I can go at about 300 millivolts. But if I go 9600 baud, if I have the high speed version of the TNC, I actually have to put in almost 2 volts of level signal to get it to operate right. And so that's a big change. And so it's and if it's not right, you're just not going to have good, reliable communications. People are going to be frustrated. I'm going to talk about a way that any of you in this room can actually set the levels to a fairly precise way without having a fancy deviation meter. So I actually talk about how to do that, which, you know, I borrowed a service scope from Rick when I was doing all this just to make sure I had sort of like a gold standard. And it was really an eye-opening experience when I realized that it was hard to do by ear. A long time ago, when we first got started in packet radio, you used to keep turning up the volume until you just didn't hear the volume any louder on a monitor radio. Well, some people have better hearing than others, and mine wasn't very discriminating, it turns out. And so we're going to talk about how to set the audio from the TNC. Okay. Now, it's important, if it's not set properly, you're going to get marginal communications. You're going to get lots of retries. You're going to time out. You're going to failure to connect at all. And if it's driving it too hard, you're going to mess with adjacent frequencies, which is always rude. And finally, it's just frustrating. If you talk to all the people that were part of this exercise and did all the training over the last few weeks, we were pretty successful, but there was a lot of frustration out there when we weren't able to connect. So, you know, frustration is never good. So if you want to set this and you want to use the right tools, you need a deviation meter. A deviation or modulation analyzer. You can get some real cheapies for about 30, 40 bucks. Decent ones are going to cost you anywhere between $300 and $1,000. They used to sell a lot of them for CBs, but they didn't work so well. If you need a service monitor, you can actually buy a service monitor these days for about $1,000. But if you want a really good one, it's going to cost you upwards of $8,000. And it's amazing. The one that Rick let me borrow was an old Motorola service monitor, and it was a great device, and it does all sorts of cool things. Weighs 60 pounds. Lauren Flint has a new one, and it weighs maybe 10 pounds at the most, and is about the same size as that projector. So it's and the one I borrowed from Rick is a suitcase. Now it turns out that I have someone donated a modulation analyzer to the club, a Hewlett Packard. It's really nice, and I have that currently on my bench on semi-permanent loan, so I can help anybody who wants to check their equipment. It turns out that some of the new rigs have a spectrum display. So in theory, if you have one of those 9700s, you could actually look at the width of the spectrum and make some judgment. Now, having tried to measure the width of the spectrum off of screen before, it's not as easy to do. A numerical measurement would be a lot better, but you can do it. a really interesting cheap thing. There's a whole suite of tools that you can buy for these little dongles, USB dongles that are wideband receivers. And most of the software is for Linux, but you can get some Windows tools. And you can plug that in because it's a wideband receiver, goes up to a couple gig. And it'll actually do, you can actually do spectrum analyzer with it. You can actually measure deviation. You can do all sorts of really cool things with it. These little dongles cost you about 25 bucks and the software is usually free. But you got to have some really good computer skills to get those to work. And then the final thing I'm going to show you tonight, which turned out to be pretty clever. It turns out you can get a cell phone app that's a sound meter. And it measures the sound, the ambient sound in decibels. And using that and a second receiver, you can actually make some pretty doggone good deviation settings using this technique. And I'll show you how to do that. So when I started doing this, I said, well, I'm going to go look for the specifications on each of the radios to see what it says that you need to feed the data port to make it work. Well, I started with the radio I was using, which was an FTM 100. Nowhere, anywhere in that manual does it state the deviation, how much signal needs to come in to get good deviation. Nowhere. However, the FTM 400 has the same diagram, but it has 3 extra words on it that says 300 millivolts. So it does have the data in it, but my particular one didn't. So I went looking at all different kinds of radios, looking for the specification. I looked at ICOMs, I looked up some Kenwoods, and I was able to find it in a lot of cases, but it wasn't easy. You really have to go hunting for it. And the other thing, so here's an example of the FTM 400. And this shows 300 millivolts is needed to do the 1200. And then it has 2 different outputs depending on where they pick off the data when on the receive. Go to the next one. So this is an ICOM 7300. You actually have to go hunting for it here, but I think it says 100 millivolts. Okay, so it says modulator input, 100 millivolts down there, item 11. So if you got an ICOM 7300 and you're using the KPC3, its default's going to be putting out 50 millivolts. So you're not going to get, you're going to get at least less than half standard deviation if you use the default setting. So you actually need to adjust the level setting in order to get a decent output. Next one. This was a Kenwood T71V. A lot of people have those. It's a great radio. And on this one, it says 40 millivolts. So that's not too bad. But look here, if you try to run the 9600, you got to use 2 volts peak to peak in order to get that to work right. So it just depends on what baud rate you're running and which TNC you have. Go ahead next. This is the FT8800s. The reason I put these up here is these are in a lot of the Go kits, the orange kits. A lot of people have them. I have an 8900 and I put it on the bench here this last week. And you'll notice that for 1200 baud, it's 40 millivolts, which is really nice. But again, 2 volts peak to peak to get the 9600. So if I were to try to go 9600 with this, I'd have to have that level quite a bit higher in order to go. So I copied this out of an old PK232 manual because this is what gave me the idea for how to do this. They talked about the deviation of 2.75 kilohertz. That's a good ballpark. Between 2.5 and 3.3 thereabouts is probably a pretty decent deviation to have. It's not, but it turned out the way mine was set up originally, I was 0.6 kilohertz. Not good. You know, 2.5 would be okay. So they talk about how you just adjust the audio level until you don't hear, doesn't sound any louder. But they said use your touch tone and try to match the volume of the touch tone. So I was thinking about that a little bit, but you know, my hearing's not so good. How do I adjust the level to try to match if your hearing's a little foobar? So I had to find a better way to do this. And so one of the first things I said is, well, you can adjust the level. If you go into WinLink, it actually has a place where you can mess with it depending on which TNC you have. And it's a very strange level. So if you set the level from 0 to 256, it jumps about a half a millivolt every count. But then after 256, it jumps 15 millivolts. So it's not a real easy conversion. So the next thing I did is I said, okay, well, I'm going to measure this. And so what I did is I went into the calibration mode on the KPC3. I can send marks, I can run spaces, I can hit the plus and minus key to adjust the level so I can actually see what's going on. And when I did this, I go ahead, next chart. I found that I could adjust the levels quite a bit, and to get the right deviation, this is just a superfluous slide. Next. I'm waiting for my graph. Okay, let me talk about the setup. Laptop with the dumb terminal and the WinLink, both of them loaded up. The KPC3, I had the FTM 100 into a dummy load, and I had the service monitor. And then I had this other little setup, which I'll talk more about. I had just another HT, a separate receiver, so to set it mid volume, and I used a sound measuring app on my cell phone. And I'll show you a little bit about how that works in a minute. Next slide. And this is what it shows like when I had it set up. You can see the spectrum display, and trying to measure the width on the spectrum display wasn't too good. But up at the top there, it says deviation 3.18 kilohertz. So it was really nice having the service monitor. Once I got it in the right mode, I just sort of keyed the transmitter and I measured the deviation. It was fantastic. Made it really easy. Next slide. So this is what the setup looked like. Here's my Go kit, the spectrum analyzer. And then over here on the left is where I got this little thing going with my HT and the sound app. And so you can see the sound app there is the needle will wiggle depending on the amplitude of the sound. And so I can, the laptop's a little more over to the left. You can't see it, but I can trigger the whole thing and then measure the sound. Next slide. So I did using the dumb terminal emulator and a combination of the calibrate and the XMET level adjust, which by the way, for every TNC, the level adjust command is different. So the KPC3 is one set, the Tiny Tracker is a different set, the PK232 is a whole nother set. So every TNC has their own command for doing this. Next slide. So here's my graph. You can see on the top bar in the orange, that's the deviation. Along the bottom is the actual setting in the KPC3. And then the voltage measured peak to peak is in the red line. And so you can see it's not very linear at all. So figuring out exactly where to set this, it takes a little bit of a thing. And remember, we want to be at about 50 millivolts. So it turns out that 50 millivolts or 100 millivolts for me works out to be somewhere around 260. Go ahead, next slide. So on my FTM 100, it turned out I had to set the level for 265 to get 3.23 kilohertz deviation. On my FT50, which I use occasionally as a remote application, I had to set the level on the KPC3 to be 57. So that was quite a bit different, and it gave me about 3.3 kilohertz. So in the Tiny Tracker, you can set the level from 0 to 128. It turns out trying to get the Tiny Tracker to do any of those higher levels is a little bit tougher. You may have to mess with them quite a bit, or even get a small amplifier in there. It was pretty limited. So they're really only going to be good for 1200 baud, and then only on radios that are roughly 50 millivolts. So the other thing is you can use the calibrate command on that. It's got a whole other set of keystrokes. You can use the 1 and the 2 key to go up and down to see how the level adjusts. And it's pretty linear. So when I went to get the Tiny Tracker to run the first time, I pulled one out of a storage unit that we had left over from Aries. It wouldn't talk at all. I had to reset it. The default was 4800, and its mode was GPS, because it was originally designed to work with GPSs, so you could drive around and transmit on APRS where you were. So it turned out that one of the first things you have to do is you have to get it to the auto baud to 19.2. You have to put the mode in KISS, and then you have to tell it your call sign. And then once you do that, when you turn it on and off, it'll come up and it'll work okay. So here, this shows you just the the real term program I was using to do the tiny tracker. You can see when I reset it, the Autobaud was 4800. I set it to 19.2. I changed the mode from GPS to KISS, and I set just check the level at 128. Next slide. And this shows you when you're actually going to calibrate mode that you can set the high tone, the low tone, and do a bunch of other things to try to get it to work out, and you can listen to it on the radio. Next slide. So let's talk about the really cool way to do this. What you do is you download a sound measurement app for your cell phone, and they got all different kinds. The one I have is pretty straightforward. Let me get the right one. And so right now when I'm talking, it's about 60 decibel to 70 decibel in here. You can see it just banging all around. There's lots of different ones out there. I went to 2 or 3 of them. One did all sorts of advertising, drove me nuts. So you want to hunt around for one that's fairly easy for you to use. This one's got a few ads, but I'm getting Albertson ads right now, but it doesn't really matter because I'm not going there. So what you do is you take your HT, you set it on the table. You set it to the frequency you want to listen to, put the volume at a fairly comfortable level. You put your sound app on the table in front of it. You don't move the sound app or the HT. Once you got it there, you just set it there. Now you go to the radio under test. You key the microphone and you generate a touch tone. And while you're generating that touch tone, you look at the sound meter and look what level it's doing. Okay? Now, and you write that down. Now what you do is you go to the terminal mode and you go to the calibrate function with your TNC and you generate the tone and you adjust the level. You get the same decibel reading that on the sound meter app. So there's some assumptions here. The number one assumption is that your radio, when the manufacturer made it, that the touch tone levels are going to be a reasonable deviation. And I went through and I'll show you here where I looked at all different my radios, and they were fairly consistent. They were all above 2.5 kilohertz, and they were all below roughly 3.5 kilohertz deviation. So it's in the range that we want. The other thing about this is all of the calibration issues, you've avoided them. It doesn't matter the volume on the HT, and it doesn't matter the distance, because what you're doing is you're matching a level. So whatever the level was that came through the whole system with the touch tone, you're matching that with the TNC. So you're going to be pretty close to the actual deviation that the touch tones did. Okay, next slide. So these are all the different variations of the touch tones that were on the radios. And you can see my old FT50 was 2.25 kilohertz. The 4X was 3.3. The FT736 was 2.5. The 8900 that's in the car is a little hot. It's 3.45. So it's not as consistent as we would like, but it's always in the ballpark, and it's always close enough that if you use that, you should be pretty decent deviation when you're all set up. Go ahead. So when I did this and I used the HT method, I calibrated the KPC 3 with my FTM 100, and I got at 265, I got a deviation of 3.2, and at 260, I got a deviation of 2.6. So you see, just a few counts made a pretty big difference in the deviation. When I did the FT736, for those of you, it's an ancient radio, but it hears really, really well. I use it in all the weak signal contests. That one turned out that it gave me a touch tone of 70 dB and a deviation of 3.05. I did the FT50 and it did the touch tone, and it got me a deviation of about 2.5 kilohertz. And then I tested these in a real WinLink situation. I got much fewer timeouts. I got connected every single time, first time. It really worked pretty well. So this is a way you can do that without any real fancy instruments. So why we do this? Because we want to get connected past data, do a good job. We don't want to QRM the other frequencies. You want to get accurate information about the levels. Collecting data on all the various TNCs and the radios is a real issue. You have to go hunt for it. Finally, I focused on those 2 TNCs only because they were the ones that we're using mostly through the group of people. There are some others, some like the PK232s and that all have the same kind of issues and various things. The sound meter app and your an extra HT or an extra radio is a great way to do this. And finally, I verified this using an actual deviation meter, and it worked pretty well. So with that, I'd like to open the floor to any questions people have or comments about this process for getting the deviation set. The program that the question was, what was the program on the phone? And this particular app, let's see what it says. It just says sound meter app. I have to go. I'll have to go my app and get a better idea for you, John. But yep. So, and I've tried several of them. This is the one I like a little better. So I don't know the exact name of it. I'll have to look. It just says sound meter app. Anyone out there on the Zoom call have questions?
Yes, I was just wondering, you had mentioned about the tiny tracker that you might need to put an amp in there to get enough out of it. Is that going to be a problem, or do we need to think of replacing them with something else?
Well, some of the radios need 100 millivolts, and the default setting for the tiny tracker basically is about 50 millivolts. So it could be a problem. There is an adjustment pot on the tiny tracker. I did not mess with it. You need a super micro screwdriver to adjust it. So you might try adjusting that potentiometer first before you do the electronic adjustment to try to get the voltage up. So if it's an older radio, it's going to work just fine with the 50 millivolts. If it's a newer radio, they vary anywhere from 100 to 300 millivolts in order to work. And so the tiny tracker might have a little bit of an issue in those cases. But that's a really good question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Well, I guess with that, we're back to the agenda item. Okay. Yeah.
Hello.
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I had a comment about the tiny tracker.
Yeah, go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, this is Mark. On the tiny tracker, I found out through the School of Hard Knocks about the process of setting the auto baud. It's not as easy as you portrayed. What you're going to have to do if you want to set the tiny tracker in auto baud is first recognize whether you had left it in KISS mode or not, or one of the other modes. That's part of the problem. But first thing you've got to do with the tiny tracker is disconnect it from the radio, because that will supply power to the tiny tracker with their standard cables. The second thing to be aware of with the tiny tracker is once it signs on and you want to put it in auto baud mode, you have 1 second to get the first escape key pressed. You don't press it in time, it will ignore you. School of Hard Knocks.
And Mark, it'll ignore you forever. I agree.
Yeah. So you have 1 second after power up to get the auto baud going, and that's it. The escape key really quickly. I had to do that the hard way. And the other thing is, like I said, don't connect it to the radio.
So most of the tiny trackers that we have in the orange kits have a separate power connection. And so it was really convenient to plug and unplug it to get it started, Mark. So I agree with you. But if you had it wired up so it was stealing power from the radio, yeah, you're in deep trouble there without the external power supply.
Yeah, mine came from a factory. The cable's already pre-made for my FT400, And I plug it in and the tiny tracker is powered up from the radio.
Yeah. I can understand. There is a lot of frustration with the tiny tracker, but on the other hand, the price is right. You know,
Yeah.
so it's like so many other things. I'm amazed at what they charge you for a KPC3 because it's a simple printed circuit board. It's a relatively cheap microprocessor. It's you know, only a 4-layer board by today's standards. It ought to be, you know, a $50 item, but they charge you a lot. So. Any other questions? Thank you for that, Mark. That's very appropriate. Someone else in here with a question? No? Okay, I guess we'll go to the next slide then. The repeater status hasn't changed. We still are waiting to hear about the D-Star move to OHSU. We understand the person that was coordinating that got COVID, and so they've been out of the picture for a while. So hopefully we'll know something in the next month or so. Okay. Next slide. First of all, I want to thank Gary Takis. The process of putting the new website together really made it very clear how much work Gary has done for the club for years with the website and all the work he's done. And I think everybody in this club owes Gary an appreciation of thanks for all the work he did with that website. You cannot believe how many little different pieces needed to be touched and updated when we went to the new website. Having said that, Gary, thank you very much if you're on the call, and we all appreciate all the work you've done on that over the years. It's for those of us. Now to put the new guy on board, Jeff is the person who helped develop the new website, and Jason has helped out here with some issues as well. And so I want to say thank you very much for Jeff for taking the initiative and putting that all together. We realize we still have a few typos on there and a few issues. Be patient with us. If you see something, let us know. We'll try to respond and get it fixed as soon as possible. But Jeff still is a fully employed individual, so it's his spare time that he spends working on it. So it may take a few days to get some things fixed. Yes, Floyd. Yeah. So it got it. That was a new thing that's been added, and it's a lot easier. Yes, Delvin.
If you compare the amount of content on our club versus almost any other club in the country, there are very, very few that come even close, not even 10% to the content we have in the depth of it.
No, and having helped Jeff put all that old content together on a new site, it became very apparent to all of us just how much information there is on that website. Everything from the calendars to the repeaters. You can go and look at presentations from 15 years ago that are still on there, slide sets, all sorts of stuff. So it's pretty amazing. And taking what Gary had done and giving it a fresh look was a lot easier to do, having had all that information. It's if you look at the site map, there's like, you know, probably close to 30 items on the site map. And if you go to look at most clubs' website, they might have 2 or 3 pages at the most. So it's a real testimony to everything that the club did before in Gary's work. So any questions about the website? I do need to mention, you need to clear your bookmarks and you need to refresh your DNS server, because if you don't, you can still get some old pages still pop up. Like the iWarn page was still popping up, the old one for me, until I did a purge of my DNS. So clear, if you have bookmarks to the existing website, the old one, you're going to need to clear those and redo them, because some of the stuff, even though it's pretty consistently laid out, it does have a different URL to reach it, especially some of the stuff with membership and the PayPal. On the PayPal, we're working at improving it even more, but it is up and running and working better, and hopefully we're getting the information to Judith now that we were. Well, have you gotten any new things in the last couple of days, Judith? Okay, well, Okay, so we're aware of the problem. We are working on it. So next slide. The banquet, we rolled the dice, we looked at the forecast, and we said we should be in a lull with COVID in the first week of May. Okay, so and that's so we're going to have the banquet's going to be here. It's going to be catered. We're going to ask $20 for adults, 15 for children. Barb has tickets for sale over there. And so, and if you don't buy them here, if you can at least email Barb or myself and let us know ahead of time, we'll make sure we can get a hold of you and get the tickets taken care of. So we'll probably have a couple, it'll probably be a buffet style, and we'll have a couple different entrees, but it shouldn't be fairly similar to what we did. And we have plenty of room in here to put in tables and spread out a little bit, so we won't need quite this much space that we've had before. Are there any questions about the banquet issues that we need to address? Anyone out in the Zoom call has questions? Yeah, so it's going to start at 6:30, sort of a social time, and then dinner at 7. After dinner, then we start the presentations and the awards. It normally lasts about an hour and a half to 2 hours because there is a lot of awards. There's a lot of stuff we do and give out. So just to let you know. And it is a chance to dress up a little bit. You know, suit and ties aren't required, but maybe not my dirty blue jeans kind of thing. Okay. Next slide. Any other brief remarks or questions that people have or things that they want to bring up at the end of the meeting? Salem Ham Fest is next weekend. Pulley Up is going to be March 15th. 11th and 12th, and that's a big one as well. Any other, Floyd, you had your hand up, what were you going to say? Okay, you're talking about us doing G Creek again? If we have a G Creek leader step forward and wants to take that to the lead, we'll definitely consider it. That's been really, we quit doing it because we lost leadership and getting everybody to do the 24 hours schedule to keep the G Creek open. We have all the G Creek supplies. I have 8 totes of supplies in the field day locker. They have to be audited and go. But if you're interested in taking the lead on getting G Creek to go, we do have to do reservations with the State Department of Transportation ahead of time. So although they haven't been very occupied, it's been an issue. Yes. So a driver respite at the rest area that's a battleground. It's called G Creek. We offer coffee, usually cookies and refreshments. For drivers who are tired, people who have been traveling a lot, they can pull in, get a cup of coffee, a little bit of a snack, and just take a break from the drive. It raises money for the club. We ask a little donation jar. People can put money in. I believe it's a pretty moderate amount of money that we've raised, maybe $300 or $400 on a weekend kind of thing. Back in Michigan, where we're from, there was a group that did one of these on the 4th of July weekend every year, a ham radio group, and they used to raise $3,000 to $5,000 every year. So, but then again, they were on this highway that was bumper to bumper from the Mackinac Bridge to Detroit. So people were a lot more appreciative of that cup of coffee. So yes, Stan. Actually, I'll give it to Bern to make a comment about that.
One quick comment. Do you usually run a radio station while you do that coffee stop?
Yes. All right, so MS Walk. Um, Jim, who has been doing this for, I don't know for how long. I think when he did it the first time, I was probably still in high school. So I think something like that. He couldn't do it 2 years ago or last year, whatever. He asked someone to help him, and I raised my hand. And then we didn't have MS Walk last year. You may know this. And I thought, okay, that's it. I don't have to do it again. Jim was supposed to be on a cruise, which got canceled. You can imagine. And then this year, guess what? He is on a cruise again. So, so I'm going to get to do this. So we do not have a lot of information. I can give you the date. It's going to be Saturday, April 23rd. The time is approximately from 8 to 1. And we need about, I think, 15 volunteers. Correct me if I'm wrong, Jim. There will be a couple of changes because I think start and end of the walk used to be in the park downtown, the Easter Short Park. And most of you probably know there was a fire recently and the whole park is now closed down. And I think will remain closed down for many, many months. So there will be a few changes for those who have participated in the past. We should have more information next month. And then we will also come up with a sign-up sheet. For the time being, there is a website or an email address, ms-walk@w7aia.org. So if you're interested and you want to raise your hand now, do it now, or come to me after the meeting and I will write down your name. Any questions for MS Walk? Yeah. I heard that. You're welcome.
So everybody that heard that, when it's the MS Walk time, what we want to do is we want to time it so all of us call at once and start staying out. Not that ever happened. Okay, any other important remarks that we've missed? Yes, Rick. Okay, all right. Rick has volunteered for GCARC, so that's really cool. We'll you got to get a hold of the website and see if we can get re-registered again. So we may have to do some application stuff to get that going. Sounds great. Thank you, Rick. Very cool. All right. Anything else for the good of the order? All right. Well, thank you very much for putting up with us this evening. It was a great evening. Now we think we're down to the 50-50. So we get James moving here and we'll find out who wins the money. Hey, Wayne, how many tickets did you buy tonight? How many did you buy? Okay. Well, I like to evaluate my odds of winning. If Wayne buys them, you never win. So, yep.
Okay, real quick, before we give away this large sum of money here, I want to thank everybody that showed up for the Zoom training, iWarn Zoom training, last Thursday. We had a fantastic show out. 29 people showed up. All the people who attended the training will get a certificate when I learn how to draw them out. But I was told to do that, so I got to figure out how to do that. But we had quite a response from people, new amateur operators who would like to become net control operators on the iWarn net. For all the new people who don't know, the iWarn net is a net where we collect visual situation reports, information, and send it to CRESA. And you say, well, why are you going to do that? Well, briefly, back when the Cascadia exercise was being put together, it was figured out that they didn't have enough cops and firemen to go out and do windshield surveys of the area where damage has occurred. So Gary Takis, Tim, and John Gaynor said, well, how many ham operators do we have in Clark County? At any given time during the year, we have at least 1,500 licensed operators, not counting silent keys, expirations. So that's a lot of eyes. 1,500 operators give you what, 30, 35, 3,400 eyeballs out there looking at stuff. I mean, it's free resource gathering for the emergency coordinators down at Cressa. For all you don't know, Cressa is not 911. Cressa is Emergency Operating Center for the Clark County Amateur Regional Services Agency or something like that. I can't remember. But anyway, it's good. And that's what we do. We practice that. In other words, we have the 14724 repeaters, our primary operating frequency. But if the repeater goes down in an earthquake or power goes out, we use simplex. And last night net was the 2-meter simplex net. We practiced that. We practice propagation on simplex twice a month, one on 2 meter and one on 70 centimeters. The 70 centimeter is the weakest link we have because of the frequency itself and the terrain and the topography of the county. So it takes a lot of people to get a message on 440 simplex from up in Yaco down to Washougal, unless you got a multi-height antenna and running power. So you need a lot of people. So the more people we got, the better it will operate if we ever have to use it. And so far, we have not had to use it. Every club member is a member of the IWARNet, whether you know that or not, but you are. Every club member is a member of the IWARNet, because if something is going on, you turn your radio on and let somebody know, and we pass that on. So that was a good thing. All right. Tonight we have, I believe it's $61 in the 50-50 pot. So I think Marilyn bought a ticket. I didn't let her drive. John, you bought a ticket tonight? Okay, good. So if you don't win, blame John. There you go. Thanks, sir. For all you don't know, John, KE7VSC, is one of the net control operators on the YL system net. So he and the other operators around the country run the net every day. I checked in at John once and gave him a DX contact from Vancouver to Portland. But anyway, all right, are we ready? $61. Tonight we're giving away in the 50-50. The last four numbers are, let's try 3931. 3931. Come on up here, sir, and collect your money. I got it somewhere here. And this is Steve, N6 Alpha Delta Victor, 3931. There you go, sir. Thank you.
So I did want to make one comment. IWARNet on Thursday night, we had a guy listening in who's a fairly active net controller, and he came on after they ran the simplex net and said it was one of the most professional net operations he had ever heard. So it was a very good compliment to the IWARN people. So with that, please stack your chairs when you're done, and thank you very much for being here this evening.